Most people that have even played a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! Know that the Forbidden and Limited list, sometimes referred to as the ban list, is out there. And the reason people know this is because even when they play casually with their friends might say things like, hey, you can't use 3 copies of Pot of Greed in your deck, that card is banned. On the Forbidden and Limited list, you have cards that are semi-limited and limited and even forbidden from competitive use, but the thing about that list, at least in theory, is that cards move on and off of it from format to format depending on what Konami sees fit for that particular era of Yu-Gi-Oh! And while it is fun looking at the nuances among the Forbidden and Limited list cards, especially the ones that are banned, and we've recently done that in a couple videos, in today's video we're looking at something different. We're looking at cards that for all intents and purposes are illegal from competitive play. Now, what is the difference between an illegal card and a forbidden card? After all, in both cases you can't use them in duels. Well, the big difference is that when we're looking at all the different types of illegal cards, of which we'll cover all of them in today's video, they actually say on the physical card that they can't be used in a duel in one way or another. You'll see as we go through here that the way that Konami has written on the card that they can't be used has changed a couple times, but in general just know that the card itself, if it's illegal, actually says it on the physical printed card, whereas banned cards don't imply that at all. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't the first game to do this. We see Pokemon cards, I mean, I think back to the Ace Spec cards, all of which say on the card right there that you can only have one Ace Spec in your entire deck. So it's not a completely new idea to sort of put restrictions on deck building on the actual cards, but for Yu-Gi-Oh! We pretty much only see it with these illegal cards. The vast majority of the cards that say this card cannot be used in the duel are what we refer to as match winners, and you might have heard of these, maybe you haven't, but a lot of people have, even if you don't play a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Just because the match winners are like the most expensive cards in the entire game, and for a good reason. You can only get these by doing well at the actual World Championship. The steps even to get to the World Championship are already ridiculous, but to not only get there, but also to top the event and make it almost to the finals just to get these match winners, I mean, that is just ridiculous. There are so few copies of these, and a lot of them sell for over $1,000 per card, but in some cases we actually had these reprinted for sort of the lay people, the common folk that are trying to play these cool match winners, except, oh wait, they can't play them because all of them, even the replica versions that Konami puts out in some special sets, they all still say this card cannot be used in a duel. It's also possible that you've seen a card similar to this that didn't say that in the corner, and that is Victory Dragon. Victory Dragon is the only match winner card that was legal for some time. It is currently forbidden, and I've talked about it in many videos why it'll probably stay forbidden. If you're a little bit confused about these cards and why they matter, because maybe you're saying, well, of course you win the match if you reduce your opponent's life points to 0, the difference between a game and a match as far as a technical term goes is that a match is the best 2 out of 3 that you play at a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournament. In the case of the match winners, if you summon them and successfully pull off their effects, you would win the best 2 out of 3. The problem with these cards, outside of the fact that they're world's prize cards and people aren't really meant to play them, is that from a design standpoint, it really gets screwy when you sort of think about the tournament experience against and with those cards. What I mean by that, and sorry to anyone that's already heard this, 'cause I've talked about it in a few videos, but basically the issue with cards like Victory Dragon is that anytime you want to in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Game, you're allowed to scoop, which basically means you're allowed to admit defeat and go to the next game. Where this comes up with Victory Dragon and cards like it is that when your opponent summons Victory Dragon, when they set it up, they summon those 3 dragons, they summon the Victory Dragon, the opponent can just quit the game and move on to game 2 or move on to game 3, effectively nullifying the entire effect of it, and it's just a really awkward situation for everyone involved. So that's one of the reasons that the match winners, the prize card versions, are definitely made illegal. The other reason is that they're way too expensive and there aren't even enough copies in rotation for players to even get like a play set of some of them. The idea of those types of cards, this doesn't really work for the competitive TCG, so Konami just makes them as cool prize cards that you can't use in actual games. But perhaps where most people deal with this card cannot be used in a duel, and also perhaps an area that causes a ton of confusion, is the original 2005 printings of the God cards. Now, why are the Egyptian God cards illegal for play? Well, those versions of the cards are illegal illegal, not because they're all powerful like some of my commenters seem to think, but more so because they are normal monsters that have weirdly colored outlines. And what I mean by that is that in the case of Obelisk, it has a blue outline despite not being a ritual monster. Slifer is a red outline. There's no cards like that. And Ra looks kind of similar to an effect monster, but in all three cases, they don't actually have effects. They just have descriptions of what they came from in the anime. While that's all fine and dandy for collector's items, obviously those types of cards can't be used in a duel. You might say, well, just let people use those versions. Everyone knows what the cards do already. As someone who gets a lot of comments about the Egyptian God cards, people that even watch the anime can't seem to agree what the effects of these cards are, so Konami eventually printed like 6 years later official versions of these cards, sometimes with these original artworks, but never with the special backing and never with the special descriptive text on these cards. So the Egyptian God cards, no fault of their own, of course, but a lot of people seem to think they are banned from tournament play for being too powerful, but it's actually just because they don't really look like real cards and they break a lot of the conventions that normal cards are supposed to follow. So I noticed that a lot of people got confused about that in many of my Egyptian God card videos. These cards aren't banned from tournament play. They're not on the forbidden and limited list. It's just the original versions of the cards, and they've reprinted them a few times in more modern releases, but the versions of the cards that have descriptive text and weird colors, those versions are not legal for play just because they go so far off the normal card convention. Nothing to do with their power level, just how they look and how they would act in a tournament setting. Perhaps the rarest example of this card cannot be used in a duel is a set of cards that most players will never see in their life and that there aren't really a lot of great pictures of. What I'm referring to is the unofficially released Upper Deck Seal of Orichalcos cards. Now, there's a lot of stories behind these particular cards. Whether or not they exist is sort of up in the air. You find plenty of old school players and old school Konami and Upper Deck employees claiming that they've seen them. What we know though is that at least in some capacity there were versions of the Seal of Orichalcos long before the official card was released, and Upper Deck employees would play these in side events at bigger events back in the day. And while there aren't many pictures of the Seal of Orichalcos that these Upper Deck employees were using, we do at the very least know that it did have something in the bottom left hand corner that likely said not an official Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG card. This makes sense because Upper Deck was sort of co-owning Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time, so they really need to make sure if they were printing cards like this that they put a special sort of line of text on there that said that they weren't official cards, just for fun use. And obviously if you read the card, it mentions like taking your opponent's soul. People probably wouldn't think that those were real cards, and also it'd be really hard to get your hands on them in the first place, but it's just a precautionary measure just in case someone takes a picture. Even though we don't have that many pictures, at least when people took pictures of these cards, they knew if they shared it with their friends that it wasn't an official card. At the 2007 World Championship, Konami gave out a really cool card that I've actually seen in person a few times at YCS events and players collectors cases, and that's Get Your Game On. So this was given specifically to people at the World Championship that year. This is the only time Konami has ever done this, and this card is hilarious. I wish it was legal, but it's not, and it says not usable in official duels. So a little bit different than this card cannot be used in duels, but just another way of saying it. It seems like Konami couldn't quite figure out or agree upon how to actually put that back in the day. Anyway, this thing says you can only play this card if you were present at the 2007 Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading Card Game World Championship. The attack of all of your Elemental Hero and Neospatian monsters on the field is doubled. Obviously not the best card out there, but still a pretty funny card. The main issue with it, and the reason that it's banned from official duels, is because there's no way to actually know if your opponent was at the 2007 World Championship. There's like literally no way, unless they were actually a competitor in that event, and you can look it up on your phone, to know when you're playing against someone if they activated this card in their crazy Neospatian deck, if they were actually at that event or not. It's something that sort of doesn't work in an actual real life example. Maybe if this is in the anime, it only works if like a character went to a particular tournament, but as far as real life goes, can't really print a card like this. But it is still a very cool collector's item, and one that you can find at bigger events. A lot of different locals still have like one of these lying around. They're going for pretty high prices, but it's still a pretty cool piece of history. A lot of times when Konami imports cards from the anime into the TCG or OCG, they change the effect a lot so that it can be a physical card. An excellent example of this is Card of Demise. The anime version is outrageously powerful, and they put a ton of restrictions on it. I mean, a ridiculous amount of restrictions on it when they added it to the TCG, and the card still saw some play. So obviously maybe they didn't restrict it enough, but it's just a sort of niche card that doesn't see play in every deck. But there are tons of examples of this, but one example where they didn't change the effect was Card of Last Will. What's interesting about this card is that it doesn't seem that powerful, but what they basically decided was that instead of changing the effect at all, I'm pretty sure this is the exact effect from the anime where this appeared, instead of changing the effect at least significantly, they just decided to leave the effect as is for the most part, but make it not be able to be used in any sort of official duel. It's a really weird situation because when you read this card, I don't know if it's actually that crazy. I can understand why they made it so you can't use it, but basically the only reason that they made it like that is because it says draw until you have 5 cards in your hand. That alone is a pretty powerful effect that you don't see on a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. You don't see that kind of draw power. This isn't Pokemon or something like that. And you might see cards like card destruction sometimes or hand destruction, but those aren't really drawing that many cards that often. If you have no cards in your hand, this is a +4. You only have to trade your Card of the Last Will and then you draw 4 cards. Obviously we're sort of ignoring the setup to get to this card, which leads me to believe that I don't know if this card would be played. I mean, I'm not saying you can't trigger this card. There certainly are ways to do that, but are they competitively viable? Or is there like a deck up there where you could play Card of the Last Will as well as a card that reduces something to 0 attack and then play them in the same deck and it doesn't overall hurt your consistency? I'm not sure that deck exists, so it'd be interesting to see if they actually made this card legal. Obviously at this point it's too late to like backtrack, but it's kind of crazy to think about that. In the case of Card of Demise, they put a ton of restrictions on it and then added to the game and it still was pretty good, whereas Card of the Last Will, I feel like they could leave this effect and it wouldn't actually be played. Kind of interesting to think about, but as it stands, the reason this card cannot be used in a duel, at least from Konami's perspective, is because they didn't want to change the effect when they added it to the TCG. The last example of cards that cannot be used in a duel are kind of curious for a few reasons. So I'm talking about the cards that they added into the Yu-Gi Legendary decks, and what's crazy about these cards is that they're imports from the TV show, from the manga. So it's Glory of the King's Hand, Duelist Kingdom, and Set Sail for the Kingdom. So these are cards that were from the anime. I remember them from my childhood, but what's crazy about them is that they don't have any text besides these cards cannot be used in a duel, and that's kind of weird because there's no reason you could play. No one would think that you could put these in a deck even if it didn't have that. They basically are token cards, but they're not quite token cards because to stay true to the anime, they didn't want to have a text box like token cards do, because token cards say these cards can be used as any token, but these cards, they don't have anything. They're just blank, and yet Konami thought it was important to put these cards cannot be used in a duel. Kind of weird, but those are the last example and actually fairly recent compared to most of these other examples. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on illegal Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Konami doesn't do this very often outside of the once a year, like I guess there's 2 World Prize cards released every single year, but outside of that, Konami doesn't really print cards like this. Sometimes they import cards and then ban them immediately. That's happened a couple times in the past, not super recently, but as far as making cards right out of the gate that are illegal, Konami sort of avoids that, and for a good reason. It can be kind of confusing for players to buy cards and then they get them, they're like, wait a second, I can't even use these cards that I just bought. But anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.